What happens when one of television's most beloved sitcom stars comes face-to-face with a host who's clearly done his homework on controversy? You won't believe what unfolds when David Schwimmer sits down for what was supposed to be a light-hearted, promotional interview, only to find himself trapped in an increasingly hostile interrogation that would ultimately expose the dark side of late-night television. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below because you're not going to believe what unfolds. Last night's episode of The Late Show started like any other. The audience was buzzing with anticipation as Stephen Colbert delivered his opening monologue with his trademark smugness, the camera capturing every calculated gesture and perfectly timed pause. But what nobody in that studio audience could have predicted was that they were about to witness one of the most uncomfortable and explosive confrontations in late-night television history. David Schwimmer walked onto the stage with his familiar, easy smile, waving to the crowd as the Friends theme song played softly in the background. The audience erupted in applause and nostalgic cheers, clearly delighted to see Ross Geller himself in the flesh. Schwimmer seemed relaxed, even jovial, as he made his way to the guest chair, adjusting his suit jacket and settling in with the confidence of someone who had done this dance 1,000 times before. "David Schwimmer, everybody!" Colbert announced with theatrical enthusiasm, though those paying close attention might have noticed something cold lurking behind his smile. "It's so great to have you here. You know, I have to say, seeing you walk out here just now, I couldn't help but think about how you've managed to stay relevant all these years after Friends ended." The comment hung in the air for a moment, and Schwimmer's smile faltered almost imperceptibly. "Well, Stephen, I'd like to think I've been doing good work long before Friends and certainly after. Theater, directing, advocacy work—" "Oh, absolutely, absolutely," Colbert interrupted, his tone dripping with false sincerity. "Though let's be honest, when people see you they still shout, 'We were on a break,' don't they? Must be limiting." The audience chuckled nervously, sensing something off about the exchange, but not quite sure what. Schwimmer shifted in his chair, his media-trained composure still intact, but showing the first hairline cracks. "I'm grateful for the show's impact, Stephen. It opened doors and gave me a platform to do other meaningful work." "Meaningful work," Colbert repeated, leaning back in his chair with a predatory gleam in his eyes. "Speaking of which, I wanted to talk about your involvement with the Rape Treatment Center in Santa Monica. Noble cause, really. Though I have to ask, and forgive me if this seems pointed, but given some of the recent conversations about accountability in Hollywood, how do you navigate being an advocate for survivors while also being part of an industry that has, shall we say, a complicated relationship with these issues?" The question landed like a punch to the gut, and the studio fell into an uncomfortable silence. Schwimmer's jaw tightened, and for the first time since sitting down, his carefully maintained composure showed genuine strain. "I think that's exactly why advocacy is so important, Stephen. Those of us who have platforms have a responsibility to use them for positive change." Right, Colbert nodded, but his expression suggested he wasn't satisfied with the diplomatic answer. "But isn't there something almost performative about it? I mean, you're an actor, after all. How do we know when David Schwimmer, the advocate, is being genuine versus when he's just playing another role?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Several audience members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and even the band seemed to tense up. Schwimmer's knuckles whitened as he gripped the arms of his chair, his professional mask finally beginning to slip. "I don't think my sincerity about preventing sexual violence should be questioned, Stephen. That's a pretty low blow, even for a comedy show." "Oh, I'm not questioning your sincerity," Colbert replied with mock innocence, though his smile had taken on a distinctly cruel edge. "I'm questioning the effectiveness of celebrity activism in general. I mean, how many photo ops and galas does it take to actually make a difference? Or is it more about making the celebrity feel better about themselves?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Schwimmer leaned forward in his chair, his voice taking on a harder edge that fans had never heard from the typically mild-mannered actor. "You know what, Stephen? I've been doing this work for over 2 decades, long before it was trendy or good for publicity. I've sat with survivors. I've helped raise millions of dollars for actual programs that help real people. So forgive me if I don't appreciate being lectured about authenticity by someone who makes a living mocking everything and everyone." The audience gasped audibly at the unexpected pushback. This wasn't the gentle, neurotic Ross they remembered, nor was it the polished celebrity they expected. This was someone who had been pushed too far and was pushing back. Colbert's eyes lit up with what could only be described as predatory excitement, as if Schwimmer had just walked directly into his trap. "Well, well," Colbert said, his voice dropping to a more menacing register. "There's some fire under all that nice guy image. I have to say, David, it's refreshing to see the real you come out. Though I have to wonder, if you're this defensive about your charity work, what else might you be defensive about?" The implication was clear, and Schwimmer's face flushed with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "What exactly are you suggesting, Stephen?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Colbert replied with theatrical innocence, spreading his hands wide. "I'm just saying that in this climate, with everything that's come out about powerful men in Hollywood, it's interesting to see how quickly some people get defensive when their motives are questioned. Makes you wonder what they're really worried about people finding out." The studio audience was now completely silent, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Even the cameramen seemed frozen, unsure whether they should keep rolling or cut away. Schwimmer stared at Colbert for a long moment, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths, clearly struggling to maintain what was left of his composure. That's really what you want to do here?" Schwimmer asked quietly, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "You want to sit here and make veiled accusations about me on national television? About my character? About my work with sexual assault survivors?" But Colbert wasn't backing down. If anything, he seemed energized by Schwimmer's distress, leaning forward like a shark sensing blood in the water. And as the commercial break approached, it became clear that this was only the beginning of what would become one of the most uncomfortable and explosive interviews in late-night television history. The commercial break couldn't have lasted more than 3 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Audience members could be seen whispering frantically to each other, some pulling out their phones to start recording, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. The show's producers were undoubtedly scrambling in the control room, trying to decide whether to intervene or let the carnage continue for the sake of ratings. When the cameras rolled again, both men had clearly used the break to steel themselves for what was coming next. Colbert's smile had become even more sinister, if that was possible, while Schwimmer sat rigid in his chair, his jaw clenched so tight you could see the muscles working beneath his skin. "And we're back with David Schwimmer," Colbert announced, to the camera, his voice carrying a false cheerfulness that fooled absolutely no one. "We were just having a fascinating discussion about authenticity and Hollywood advocacy. David, you seemed a little upset by my questions." "Upset?" Schwimmer's voice cracked slightly on the word. "Stephen, you just spent the last segment implying that my 20 years of work with sexual assault survivors is somehow fake or self-serving. Then you essentially suggested I might be hiding something predatory. So yes, I'm a little more than upset." The audience stirred uneasily. This wasn't the playful back and forth they were used to seeing on late-night television. This was something raw and ugly, like watching a public execution. "I think you're being a bit dramatic," Colbert replied, his tone dismissive. "I simply asked some questions about celebrity activism. If you're taking that as a personal attack, well, maybe that says more about you than it does about me." "Don't," Schwimmer said sharply, pointing a finger at Colbert. "Don't you dare try to gaslight me on your own show. You know exactly what you were doing, and so does everyone watching." Colbert's eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. Gaslight? That's quite an accusation, David. Though I have to say, for someone who claims to be an advocate for survivors, you seem awfully comfortable throwing around therapeutic terminology when it suits you. The cruelty in that comment was breathtaking. Several audience members actually gasped out loud, and you could hear someone near the front whisper, "Oh my God," into the stunned silence. Schwimmer's face went completely white, then flushed deep, red as the full implication hit him. "You—" Schwimmer started, then stopped, clearly struggling to find words adequate to express his disgust. "You just mocked survivors of psychological abuse. On television. Do you understand what you just did?" "I didn't mock anyone," Colbert replied coolly. "I simply pointed out the irony of someone using clinical terms to describe a simple interview. Question. Though your reaction is certainly illuminating." That was the moment everything changed. Up until then, this had been a deeply uncomfortable interview between a hostile host and an increasingly defensive guest. But something in Colbert's tone, something in the calculated cruelty of his words, seemed to break whatever restraint Schwimmer had been clinging to. "You know what's illuminating, Stephen?" Schwimmer's voice dropped to a dangerous quiet that somehow carried more menace than shouting would have. "What's illuminating is watching someone who built their career on fake moral superiority reveal themselves to be exactly the kind of person they claim to oppose." The studio fell so silent you could hear the air conditioning humming. Colbert's smile faltered for the first time since the interview began, but he quickly recovered, though there was something harder in his eyes now. "I think you're confusing comedy with moral superiority, David. Though I suppose when you've spent your entire career playing the same character, it might be hard to distinguish between performance and reality." "The same character?" Schwimmer laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You want to talk about playing the same character? You've been doing the same smug, self-righteous host routine for so long I don't think you remember who you actually are underneath it." At least Ross Geller had moments of genuine humanity. The audience was completely transfixed now, watching two grown men tear each other apart on live television. Some were recording on their phones, others sat with their mouths agape, but no one was looking away. "That's rich, coming from someone whose biggest acting challenge in the last decade was voicing a cartoon giraffe," Colbert shot back, his composure finally showing real cracks. "Tell me, David, when you're lying awake at night, do you ever wonder what your career would have looked like if you'd had actual talent instead of just being in the right place at the right time?" The words hit like a physical blow. Schwimmer actually recoiled in his chair, and for a moment it looked like he might get up and leave right then. Instead, he leaned forward, his eyes blazing with a fury that seemed to surprise even him. "You want to talk about talent, Stephen? You want to know what real talent is? Real talent is building something that brings joy to millions of people for decades. Real talent is using your platform to actually help people instead of just tearing them down for sport. Real talent is having the courage to be vulnerable instead of hiding behind a character that lets you be cruel without consequences." "Vulnerable?" Colbert scoffed. "Is that what you call this little tantrum? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks more like a privileged actor having a meltdown because someone dared to ask him uncomfortable questions." "Uncomfortable questions?" Schwimmer's voice rose for the first time, causing several audience members to jump. "You didn't ask uncomfortable questions, Stephen. You made vicious personal attacks disguised as journalism. You questioned my integrity, implied I might be a predator, mocked the very people I've dedicated my life to helping, and then had the audacity to act like I'm the problem for calling you out on it." The two men stared at each other across the desk, the animosity between them so palpable it seemed to fill the entire studio. Colbert's mask of professional detachment was completely gone now, replaced by something ugly and vindictive. "Maybe the problem, David, is that you can't handle being in a room where you're not the most important person. Maybe the problem is that you've been surrounded by yes men for so long that you've forgotten what actual criticism feels like." But as Colbert delivered what he clearly thought would be the killing blow, something shifted in Schwimmer's expression. The anger was still there, but it was joined by something else, a kind of steely resolve that suggested the real confrontation was only just beginning. "You know what, Stephen?" Schwimmer said quietly, his voice carrying a dangerous calm that somehow felt more threatening than all his previous anger. "You're absolutely right about one thing. I have been surrounded by people who treat me with basic human decency for most of my career, people who understand that disagreement doesn't require cruelty, that comedy doesn't require destruction, that entertainment doesn't require humiliation." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "But sitting here tonight, watching you perform this grotesque pantomime of journalism, I'm reminded of exactly why that matters. Because what you're doing right now, this isn't entertainment. This isn't comedy. This is just a sad, bitter man using his platform to inflict pain on someone because he can." The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Even the camera operators seemed frozen, afraid to move and break the spell of this moment. Colbert's face had gone red, his carefully constructed persona crumbling in real time. "Don't you dare lecture me about—" "No," Schwimmer cut him off, sharply holding up a hand. "You've talked enough. It's my turn now." He stood up slowly, towering over Colbert, who remained seated behind his desk. "You want to know what I think about when I'm lying awake at night? I think about the survivor who came up to me after a fundraiser and told me that seeing someone speak openly about these issues gave her the courage to report her assault. I think about the programs that exist because people decided to do something constructive instead of destructive." His voice grew stronger, more confident with each word. "I think about the fact that in 25 years of television and film, I've managed to be part of something that brings people joy instead of misery. That when people see me, they smile instead of cringe. Can you say the same, Stephen?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Colbert opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. For the first time in the entire interview, he seemed genuinely speechless. "Because here's what I know about you," Schwimmer continued, his voice rising with conviction. "I know that tomorrow morning you're going to wake up and you're still going to be the kind of person who thinks cruelty is clever. You're still going to be someone who mistakes cynicism for intelligence and meanness for wit, and that must be exhausting." The studio erupted in scattered applause, tentative at first but growing stronger as more audience members joined in. Someone near the back actually stood up, and within seconds, half the studio was on its feet applauding Schwimmer's words. Colbert looked around in shock, his mouth working soundlessly as he watched his own audience turn against him. His face cycled through a range of emotions: confusion, anger, and finally something that looked almost like panic. "You can't just—" he started, but his words were drowned out by the continuing applause. Schwimmer waited for the noise to die down before speaking again, his voice carrying clearly through the studio. "You know what the really tragic part is, Stephen? You actually had talent once. I remember watching you years ago, and you were brilliant, sharp, funny, insightful. But somewhere along the way, you decided that being cruel was easier than being clever, that tearing people down was simpler than building something up." He shook his head sadly. "I feel sorry for you. I really do. Because at the end of the day, when this show is over and the cameras stop rolling, you have to go home and live with the person you've chosen to become. And that person? That person is someone who thinks the best use of their platform is to attack people who are trying to make the world a little bit better." Colbert finally found his voice, but it came out as a desperate croak. "This is my show. You don't get to come on my show and—" "And what?" Schwimmer interrupted, spreading his arms wide. "Tell the truth? Hold you accountable for your behavior? I thought that's what journalists were supposed to do." The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The audience murmured their appreciation for the comeback, and you could see some of the crew members trying to hide their smiles. Schwimmer began unbuttoning his jacket, clearly preparing to leave. "You want to know what's really funny, Stephen? You spent this entire interview trying to expose me as some kind of fraud, trying to tear down my reputation and my work. But all you've managed to expose is yourself." He pulled off his wireless microphone and set it gently on the desk. "I came here tonight to talk about a project I'm passionate about, to maybe make people laugh, to have a good time. Instead, I got to see what happens when someone with a platform decides to use it as a weapon instead of a tool." The studio was dead quiet now, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. Colbert sat frozen behind his desk, looking smaller somehow than he had at the beginning of the show. "I want everyone watching at home to remember this moment," Schwimmer said, looking directly into the camera. "Remember what it looks like when someone shows you who they really are. And remember that you have a choice about what kind of person you want to be, what kind of energy you want to put into the world." He turned back to Colbert one final time. "I hope someday you figure out that being better than this is actually possible. That being kind isn't weakness, that building people up instead of tearing them down is actually harder and more rewarding. But that's going to be your journey to take." With that, David Schwimmer turned and walked toward the exit. The audience erupted in applause again, this time a sustained, thunderous ovation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the studio. People were on their feet, cheering, some even whistling their approval. Colbert remained seated, his face a mask of confusion and humiliation, as his guest walked away with his dignity intact and his head held high. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of the host's complete breakdown of composure. As Schwimmer reached the edge of the stage, he turned back one final time and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Good luck explaining this one to your advertisers, Stephen." And with that devastating final shot, David Schwimmer disappeared behind the curtain, leaving Stephen Colbert alone at his desk, facing an audience that was still applauding his guest's departure. The show cut to commercial immediately, but the damage was already done. In less than an hour, what had started as a routine celebrity interview had transformed into a masterclass in dignity under fire, with David Schwimmer emerging as an unlikely hero and Stephen Colbert exposed as exactly the kind of bully he had always claimed to oppose. The internet would be talking about this confrontation for weeks, and Colbert's reputation might never fully recover from the night he picked a fight with Ross Geller and lost.